Okay, good evening everybody and welcome to this panel event, Tackling Inequalities, Why Now and Where to Next. I'm Professor Colette Fagan. I'm the Deputy Dean and Vice Dean for Research for the Faculty of Humanities, and I'm very pleased to be asked to introduce this event, the first formal event of the Global Inequalities Research Beacon. Manchester has 5 research beacons, and they're selected for the critical mass of excellent research, postgraduate training, and, as important, the application of research to policy debates, innovation, delivery, and making a positive contribution to the world. The Global Inequalities Beacon encompasses, at last count, just over 200 academics and researchers, largely from within my faculty, but also stretching into the Faculty of Science and Engineering and Biological, Medical and Health Sciences. The 2 flagship institutes are the Global Development Institute, and I know there's a number of people here from there, I recognise faces, and also the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute, and again, hello to the faces that I know. So I'm really looking forward to introducing a fantastic panel, and I can already sense the excitement and buzz in the room, and I've been told it's already happening on Twitter. So I really hope you have a very interesting and stimulating and challenging discussion. But that's me, I'm simply the warm-up act. It gives me great pleasure to hand over to Anna Leach, who's a former alumni of the university, American Studies, I believe, yes. And more importantly, her current role is Deputy Editor for the Guardian Network. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Colette. Yes, I'm very happy to be here. When I was at this university, I never would have expected to be working for the Guardian and presenting a panel, so I'm really excited. Just a few, I'm the Deputy Editor of the Guardian Global Development Professionals Network, so that's the part of the Guardian for people who work in development, so have a look if you would like to find out more. And some housekeeping, we'll be taking questions from the floor, so if you have something to ask, please raise your hand, and we've got a couple of roving mics, and we're also accepting questions over Twitter on the hashtag TOI, Taking On Inequalities 17. And the panel is also being live streamed on Facebook on the Global Development Institute page. If the fire alarm goes off, it's not a drill, so leave via the exits. So yes, I think that's, and then we're just going to roll a short clip before we introduce the panel.
One of the key global challenges that the university is tackling is that of inequality. It's become evident in recent years that, along with prosperity, certainly in some countries, inequality has been rising particularly in North America, Europe, and also in Asia. Over the last 20 years, I've been researching the challenges that people face living in towns and cities in the global south. About 800 million people are living in informal settlements without adequate access to water, sanitation, often with unsafe homes, massive risk of fire, fecal contamination in pathways. Those people face immense problems. The university is really fortunate in having a group of staff who are committed to finding ways to address some of the core challenges of inequality, both in the global north and the global south. One of the areas of work that some of my colleagues have been concentrating on is a research centre called Effective States and Inclusive Development. That sounds very abstract, but actually it means research with local researchers, academics in the global south, and sometimes civil society organisations to understand just what governments can do to address the challenges of inequality. The Global Development Institute benefits from being in a school that has other critical disciplines: planning, architecture, geography and education. We have the benefit of staff who work in a multidisciplinary way, supported by very strong academics who are much more centred on the essence of their own disciplines. Then we have a great student body who in many cases bring a practical experience of challenging inequalities in their own context, and who come to Manchester to reflect and consider and build their capability to go back and be more effective in what they do.
That was Professor Diana Mitlin, who heads up the Global Development Institute at the university and is academic lead for the Global Inequalities Research Beacon. I'm now going to ask each of the panel to introduce themselves and to share what most interests them about this increasingly significant topic of inequalities, and starting with Rory.
I'm Rory Horner, a lecturer at the Global Development Institute. I'm particularly interested in the shifting geography of inequality and what it means for global development. And by that, I really mean for the last 20 years, we've actually seen a really fascinating decline in between-country inequality for the first time since the Industrial Revolution. At the turn of the 19th century, the beginning of the 19th century, most of the inequalities economic inequalities in the world were largely within countries. What mattered most was whether you were rich or poor within the United Kingdom, less what country you were in. Some estimates suggest about 20% of the inequalities in the world were between countries, but the vast, vast majority were those within countries. And for 200 years, we had this pattern of increasing differences between countries, particularly between developed and developing countries. And to such an extent, by the 1990s, around the turn of the millennium, about 80% of the inequality in the world was the differences between countries, particularly between developed and developing countries. And now we've actually seen over the last 20 years, with particular rapid growth in China, India, some decline in between-country inequalities, where we actually see now inequalities between countries are only about 65% of global income inequalities. At the same time, a big growth in within-country inequalities in many, but not all countries. And this is a really interesting issue for those of us who've been thinking about development in relation to issues in the global south. Do we still prioritize development issues in the global south as the biggest global inequalities, or do we focus a bit more on inequalities domestically in the global north? So this is a really interesting shift that I think we've seen in the composition of global inequality.
Yeah, thank you. Carolina?
Hi, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Carolina Sanchez, and I'm the Senior Director for what we call the Poverty and Equity Practice within the World Bank, which is basically a team of economists that really looks at issues of poverty and equity around the world and tries to understand what are the root causes of those two problems. And I think in a way where we are thinking about now and where inequality comes into our work is the realization that for us to reach the goal of eliminating extreme poverty in the world by 2030 with the growth prospects that we have at the moment, which are relatively low, it's going to be critical that we tackle inequality as well. So we are going to need policy packages that both promote growth but do so in an inclusive manner. Otherwise, it will be difficult to reach this goal. So in that sense, we've been exploring a little bit what has happened with inequality in recent years, along the lines of what you were saying earlier. We've seen a decrease in global inequality driven both by declines between countries as well as declines within countries in some places, which is good. But I think at the same time, we know that inequality remains unacceptably high, and that it's a problem that then we need to tackle. I think one thing that is important to remember is that some of the processes that have driven poverty reduction in recent years, such as globalization, which we know has benefited many in the world and lifting them out of poverty, have also had distributional impacts, both across countries and within countries. And I think a lot of the reaction that we are seeing today and the debate that we are seeing around inequality is driven by some of those distributional impacts. So a lot of the work that we are doing in the team currently is to think about what are policies that work to basically reduce inequality and promote growth. And I'm sure we can get a little bit more into that as we speak.
Great, thank you. And Becky?
Hi. My name is Rebecca Gowland, and I'm here from Oxfam. I've worked for Oxfam for 12 years, and I head up their UK campaigns. I'm the head of the UK campaigns department, which essentially is about pulling together campaign strategies and primarily looking at public engagement and looking at how we encourage audiences and people to be interested in solutions to inequality. So that's what I do on various issues, but predominantly on inequality, because it is a priority issue for Oxfam and for what we do. And it's a priority issue for me. So it's what gets me out of bed in the morning. It's a thing that I feel most passionate about in terms of Oxfam's work. It really is the campaign that handles the systemic issue, the big defining issue of our time. So I feel very privileged to be here and privileged to be talking about it. Inequality, obviously, is something that touched a political and a public nerve back in 2014, and before that, we launched our campaign in 2014. And the annual report that we put out at Davos every year in January focuses on this extreme growing gap between the richest and the poorest in the world. And that's attracted lots of support and attention from various actors, so obviously institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, institutions and academics such as Manchester University, and then global leaders, as we all know, Pope Francis, Obama, everybody is referring to inequality, economic inequality, as the defining issue of our time. More importantly for me, in the last few years, we've worked much harder to try and incorporate and grow the voice of people in developing countries and people on the front line of poverty, essentially. So there are inequality fighters, and raising their voice is absolutely central to what we do, and we need to be doing that more. I guess the thing about the Davos report and the thing about the statistic, 3 years ago we were saying that 85 people own the same wealth as the poorest half of the planet. This year we're saying 8 people own the same wealth as the poorest half of the planet. So wealth is moving up. There's no starker fact or illustration of that. But it's not an expose on those people. It's an expose on this broken economic system that we have, and the fact that the political system that we have in place isn't dealing with that. It's failing. It's failing the majority of citizens, and we need to act on that. We can't claim ignorance anymore. We know that poverty reduction is slowed down by inequality, and if we don't act on inequality, then we're going to be leaving millions of people suffering exclusion from growth and prosperity. But we also, this year, what's interesting for me and what's moved the debate on for me is we've set out the problem in previous years. This year at Davos, our report really focused on solutions, and we tried to use it to demonstrate what governments need to do, what private sector needs to do immediately in order to develop this what we're terming a human economy. So an economy that works for everyone rather than just for the privileged few. And some of the solutions that we outlined in terms of government is in relation to making sure that they're dealing with the rigged rules and that voice and governance is not serving the privileged, it's serving citizens, and people are paid a decent living for a decent day's work. They have access to basic services such as health and education. And then in terms of business and the solution that we put forward with regards to that is very much focused on, instead of the return to the shareholder being the central mission of business, we need to look at putting social good and social benefit at the heart of business, which we can talk more to later. So these are some of the solutions we highlighted in the report. For me, in the line of work that I do, because I'm not a kind of policy geek, I'm not an expert in that line of argument, for me, what we need to do as civil society and what we need to do in this room is take much more seriously how we communicate these solutions and these messages to the public, and that's the public in developed countries and developing countries alike. And the reason why that's so important is because we're seeing this shift, people's legitimate concerns about the state of the world and about rigged rules. They're finding answers in the wrong places right now. So this rise in populism is absolutely understandable because people aren't happy with the way that the world is working at the minute. And unless we make our messages and our solutions much more accessible and we make solutions more tangible, then we're going to see that increasing move towards greater populism and greater nationalism. So for me, the key thing is about making sure that we bring solutions, we bring people back to the solutions on inequality that we think are the right ones.
Thank you. That's great to hear about solutions and also the urgency of acting now with the rise of populism. So this topic is very close to The Guardian's heart. We recently launched a project focusing on inequalities, edited by Mike Hurd. And there was an article there yesterday, I think, saying that a new study from the University of Washington has found that life expectancy in the US varies by 20 years according to region, and that's getting worse and worse. So in developed countries, there's huge inequality as well, and it's a growing issue. And the World Bank has recognised this is now vital to ending extreme poverty, as Carolina was saying. And you worked on the 2016 flagship report, Taking on Inequality. So why was it that the bank decided to focus on this now?
I think a variety of reasons, but the main one is what I said, that is the realization that tackling inequality is critical for us to be able to meet the goals that we've set for ourselves and sort of for the development community in terms of ending extreme poverty by 2030. So that was obviously a strong motivation for us to focus on inequality. There was obviously also the contextual factors that Rebecca was talking about in terms of this topic being at the moment critical in the eyes of governments that we work with, as well as the broader public, and we thought it was important for us to be in that space and to contribute in terms of what are some of the possible solutions, what can the countries that we work with do.
So how do you promote growth and ensure that everyone is sort of brought along and it's inclusive and reduce inequality at the same time?
So unfortunately there's no silver bullet, right? I mean, I wish there was, but there isn't sort of a recipe that we can give to everybody. So a lot of these solutions are contextual. But I think what we tried to do in the report was actually look at successful experiences of countries that have managed to both grow and reduce inequality at the same time. And then ask the question, what is it that these countries are doing, and is there any common element or elements that we can learn from? And what we see there is that really most of these countries do a combination of the following. That is, on the one hand, continue to implement policies that support growth, because in a way, if you don't have a pie that is growing, it's very hard to actually redistribute that part of that pie to the bottom of the distribution. But you need to accompany that with policies that make that growth inclusive, right? So what are those policies? Policies that level the playing field, that promote more equal access to opportunities. So there we are primarily talking about human capital investments, health and education, with a strong focus on children, but not only. Policies that promote access to economic opportunities. So for example, ensuring that people are connected to markets, particularly rural communities. You were talking about spatial dimensions of inequality, within countries. These are very important, as well as just broader access to economic opportunities. And also thinking about the distributional impacts of fiscal policy. Once you take into account sort of taxes and expenditures, who's benefiting and who's not from what the government is doing in that sphere. And I think there are a variety of things that we can do to help countries have a more positive, if you want, impact on inequality through fiscal policy. So those are some of the elements that we identified as common to these experiences.
Okay, thank you very much. Rory, you recently worked on a paper called on converging divergence with David Hume about north-south boundaries blurring around inequalities. Can you tell us some about that? And you're talking about whether we should still prioritize the global south, or is the global north more of a problem for inequalities?
Yeah, so I mean, we've been really trying to think about where we can see the biggest inequalities, and particularly in relation to thinking about development, how can we factor in inequality within the global north to a greater degree. I thought maybe I'll actually ask people in the audience one question first. This is whether a child born today in the UK, do you think they will have a better life than you have, or do you think they'll have a worse life than you have? So I'll first ask for people to raise their hands if they think this is a child born in the UK today has a better life than you have now, or a worse life. So who thinks a child born today has a better life, will have a better life than you do? Some people. Who thinks a child born today will have a worse life than you've had? Okay, I'd say that's probably 70-30, something like that. So Pew Global Attitude Survey have done this survey and found actually 72% of people in the UK think a child born today is going to have a worse life. That's not distinct to the UK. 65% of people in America. The French are the most pessimistic in this survey in the world. 90% of French people think that a child will have a worse life than they have. And there's a lot of increasing awareness of the problem of growing inequality within the global north. There's a really interesting recent book by an economist called Peter Temin at MIT called The Vanishing Middle in relation to America. And there's a famous Nobel-winning economist called Arthur Lewis from the West Indies. He worked at Manchester for 10 years. He got his Nobel Economics Prize for developing a model of a dualistic economy in relation to developing countries. This recent book by Peter Temin argues increasingly the US economy is actually reflecting many characteristics of the dualistic economy that Arthur Lewis conceptualized thinking about developing countries, and we see a whole variety of indicators in relation to that. So for us, we really feel the growing significance of thinking about inequality in relation to the global north. But perhaps I can then ask a second question, if it's okay. And this question is, would you prefer to be poor in a rich country or rich in a poor country? So first, who would prefer to be poor in a rich country? Some people. Who would prefer to be rich in a poor country? Okay, I'd say that was more 80-20, 25-75. Danny Roderick has a really interesting recent paper where he's posed this question. On his calculations, taking the country at the 95th, in the top 5% of countries in the world of GDP per capita, the country he had was Norway. The country at the bottom 5%, the country he had was Niger. Within each country, taking the person at the bottom 5% in Norway versus the person at the 95th percentile in Niger, the person in the bottom 5th percentile in Norway had 5 times greater income at purchasing power parity than the richest person in Niger. That is all based on absolute inequality, and his point with that is that we actually tend to overestimate how wealthy many people are in developing countries. That there are still significant north-south differences despite growing talk of global middle classes, of global convergence, etc. So many of the absolute indicators still show that we still see very extreme inequalities faced by people in the global south. The country you live in, there's still a very big citizenship premium. And so what we've been trying to see is we do need to think much more about inequalities in the global north in relation to the biggest inequalities, but still remembering the extreme inequalities in the global south.
Yeah, I don't think we're there yet that Niger is the same as Norway, so yeah, that's a good point to make. Rebecca, it's really nice to hear about the solutions, and be great, and I've had sort of the problems laid out, but it'd be great to focus more on solutions. But just before we start that, we're going to look at a clip from Oxfam.
They have water on a daily basis. They have electricity on a daily basis. We have 3 days water flow. The rest of the 4 days we don't have water. Why should I get water 3 days and the rich man who is just 100 meters away from me is getting water every day? It is very unfair. We have no good roads. We have no proper medication. We have no quality education in our schools. We don't have clean water in our taps. We are all Kenyans, and we are entitled to get equal rights. But there are those big people who do other things that I cannot do because I don't have money. The government does not mind about the small businesses. In fact, those big companies are owned by those people in the government. And that makes me feel very bitter. You start asking yourself, where did I go wrong? Why is it that there is this family that has a lot and me I don't have? let those people be the way they are, but they have to depend on us. That gap, it is there because I don't have much money as she has, but there are some things which she cannot do without me. The beauty of that thing I have made. I do beadwork, tapestry mats. Since I started training women in the community, I have trained more than 2,000 women. There's something I'm getting out of my mind and giving them. I know somebody is going to make some income out of it. And that is what we call empowerment. So that's the most enjoyable thing I will ever talk about. Empowering my community.
Yeah, so as you mentioned about the Oxfam Davos report that has been great at raising public awareness about inequality with the bus, and that gets smaller and smaller each year. But what are sort of the next steps of that campaign from awareness to kind of making changes?
I mean, it has been absolutely amazing in terms of awareness raising as the Davos report. I mean, the reason why this film is excellent in terms of talking about like next steps and solutions is because like Jane is amazing. Jane is an amazing human being, and I love the film because of her, really. Not only does it demonstrate kind of the stark reality of inequality and the juxtaposition between what the haves and the have-nots in Kenya, what Jane represents is exactly what we all should be doing. So not only is she empowering herself to deal with a very unequal life and dealing with lack of water, lack of basic services, looking after her children, she's empowering herself in terms of her own enterprise, and she's empowering the women around her in her community. So she's taking this extremely active role. She's a member of this organisation called Shining Mothers, which encourages or trains women with business skills, and it also represents their local community and their needs with local government. So that empowerment, that active, engaged citizenship, and the fact that she is raising her voice and making kind of incremental change is absolutely key to future solutions and where we need to go with this next. Because if we don't do that, then A, we're not representative of the people that we're working with. And B, we're just living a kind of a superficial change, right? So we have this huge public media momentum with the campaign. What we don't necessarily have in the same way is this deep engagement. And that's true more true here, I think, than it is in the Global South. We're definitely building a community-based approach to dealing with inequality within the Global South. We need to do that more here and be able to entrench the messages about solutions.
So what are some of the kind of easy policy wins that could come and change things?
So in terms of easy policy wins for us, and what we've been working on. So we've been working on, for the past 3 years, we've been working on tax and dealing with, primarily with dealing with tax havens and the elimination of tax havens, dealing with tax dodging. So in this country, we continue to work on tax transparency and encouraging the government to make mandatory public country-by-country reporting. That's very central to the work that we do in the UK and in developed countries. And then something that we've been working on for the past couple of years is tax cooperation, global tax cooperation, and we're seeing that increasingly stays a part of the G77 debate as well. So tax cooperation, ensuring that developing countries have a seat at the table when it comes to negotiating tax rules, is central in terms of policy wins. And I think also it's central in terms of cooperation, right? So we're seeing countries like retreat into nation states, and I think a role for civil society continues to be to put global cooperation at the heart of what we're trying to achieve and make sure that multilateralism isn't left behind in this surge towards a greater nationalism. So policy wins in the immediate have to be around dealing with tax dodging, dealing with rigged rules that allow tax dodging to happen. That's absolutely key. But also putting back at the heart of that the impact that increased revenue means for developing countries, which is, access to, what should be access to public services, so health and education within developing countries. So fiscal justice is absolutely a key solution in the immediate, and a more kind of regional cooperative, if not international cooperative approach to minimum wages. So we're seeing increased cooperation on minimum wages in terms of the ASEAN region. Last year they committed to, Indonesia and a few other countries committed to looking at a regional minimum wage to fight the race to the bottom on labour rights in that area. I think that's certainly something that we should be seeing as an easy win. But when I say easy, I really don't mean easy, because change takes years and years to achieve. We had a really interesting talk from Oxford University and Friends of the Earth. Actually, they've written a book together about how change happens and how kind of social movements, how social movements evolve. And one of the quick wins they were referring to was the anti-slavery movement, which took 50 years to make any change happen on. So if this is the big defining issue of our time, these easy wins are going to take more than the next 6 months or the next year to achieve.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and because we had a question come through on Twitter that was about should a living wage be a human right? I don't know. What did you think about that? So I could ask the rest of the panel as well.
Yeah, I mean, a wage, what someone is paid should be enough to allow them to have a decent life, right? So you're seeing minimum wage in the Dominican Republic is 40% of what it has to be in order for people to live a decent life. You're seeing, garment workers in Vietnam working for $1 an hour for 72 hours a week, and they still can't afford to pay their medical bills at the end of the week. So I absolutely think there is, a real argument to think about, what a minimum wage represents, what a living wage represents, and whether or not that should be a human right.
Carolina, what do you think about that?
I think I would like to think about it in slightly broader terms, because I think what's behind that idea is sort of a broader concept of aiming to help every individual in the planet to live above a certain level of income, right? And we know that for most people that is labor income, so I think that's where the linkage with wages come in. I'm a bit reluctant to sort of make the minimum wage kind of the main tool that we would like to use to do that, because what we know is that many of the people that are poor are actually not in the formal sector, and definitely then any regulation on formal wages won't have any impact on them. So I much rather focus on, what are the kinds of jobs that we are creating as countries develop? Are those jobs accessible to these populations? And if they're not, how can we help them access those jobs? And that may require that we think about skills, that we think about connecting them to market. So I think the wage is sort of a piece of that. But I think if we sort of in a way focus all our efforts on the wage, we are missing sort of a large part of the population that for now is not part of formal labor markets, and they won't be for quite a while. So I think we need to sort of think of other complementary interventions, and of course as economies grow and become more formalized, then obviously that's one of your policy tools. I think the conversation that may be a little bit more relevant in the context of developing countries, and which I think is related to this issue, is what we see emerging in places like India and other countries of sort of a minimum income guarantee type of program, right? And that's more talking about transfers rather than regulating wages. And there I think my take is, I think as a principle, thinking of having everybody live above a certain income level is exactly what we are aiming for. That's what eliminating extreme poverty means in a way. And the role that I see governments playing there is targeting transfers to those people that are below that income level. So it's not so much a wage, but I think it's, some form of income support that ensures that, that those people are lifted at least up to that minimum level.
Yeah, thank you. And keep questions coming in on the hashtag as well, TOI17. Rory, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that. Do you think that a living wage should be a human right?
Well, I mean, a minimum wage, the important distinction Carolina makes is really important between whether people are incorporated in a formal labor market system or not. If people are, and as many people are, particularly in the global north, a minimum wage, I think, is something that is very important. America has seen something like a decline from $11 or $12 roughly effective minimum wage to $6 or $7 over the last 30 or 40 years, I think. And so it's also an issue where I think more and more economists are increasingly in agreement of the potential benefits of a minimum wage in the global north. So, and that's particularly thinking about, that actually reduces then the pressure on redistribution systems if there's at least some degree greater or less perhaps inequality in the market-based earnings of people before taxes and transfers. If there is less wage disparity, and we have seen growing labor market polarization, both with growth of extreme salaries at the top and then the lack of sort of effective minimum wage at the bottom.
What about something like universal basic income? That's been quite a buzzword lately of raising income levels. Did you have thoughts about that as a solution to inequality?
I mean, I was actually at a talk recently with Branko Milanovic, who's written a very well-known recent book on globalization of inequality, and I asked him this question. He was actually very skeptical. Partly he thinks it's a little bit dystopian, the idea that there will be no work for many people at all and that many people won't be incorporated in a labor market system. I think his other big concern though was how a sort of universal basic income, how that scheme would work in relation to existing welfare policies. And so is there a danger that existing welfare schemes can be rolled back and sort of disappear with a rollout of a universal basic income? On the other hand, I think Martin Ravalion had a blog post up a couple of days ago arguing that actually many of the arguments against a universal basic income are sort of straw man arguments and that there is a lot of potential for it. I think the really important thing though is that this issue is getting much more discussion and that the people who, there is much more sort of talk about the fine tuning of what this kind of policy, in which context it might work and what it might mean for existing programs too.
Yeah, definitely. Don't know, do you have anything you wanted to add on that, or should we...
No, I mean, just coming back on in terms of cash transfers, I think that's absolutely right. And I don't know what you think about the paper that the ODI put out last year, which said essentially, it's about national policy is real. We can end inequality now if we wanted to, if we put the right policies in place. In fact, we can. The ODI paper said we could end 3/4 of poverty, extreme poverty, if we just made different choices. Instead of developing countries investing money in or kind of tax cuts in things like tax subsidies and things like fossil fuels and investing increasing amounts in military spending, we could transfer, if you could put that money into cash transfers for the poorest people, you could actually lift 3/4 of people out of poverty. So I absolutely think that's key, and I think it's just another great reflection of the fact that, you know, this is about a political choice, and the rules that we're kind of living by at the minute are wrong. They're rigged, and that those political choices can be made, and we can indeed eradicate poverty at a much greater level, or faster level, if we decide to.
Okay. Thank you. So let me just see if there's any more questions on the hashtag, and then we will go to questions. Maybe should we go to questions now? Yeah. If you've got a question, please put your hand up. Should we go to this guy here? And someone in the front row here?
My name's Paul Harnett. I'm from World Basic Income. I've read the Martin Ravalion article, and I refer to what Carolina said, and that's everyone living above a certain income level. That's what you want. It's really, really easy. 1.2% of world income can pay for $10 a month for everyone in the world. Okay, if you don't want to go that fast, it's really cheap to do the 12 poorest countries in the world. It's not a problem. We've spent billions and billions over the course of the last few decades on aid, for example. If you just used that money and gave it to the poor, you would solve extreme poverty.
Is that a question or a comment?
Well,
Why?
okay, we were talking about we need inclusive growth. I'm really disappointed to hear that. We've got the money right now. It's there. We don't necessarily need inclusive growth. Inclusive growth would be great, but it's a political choice, as Becky just said. The money's there right now. We either use it or we don't. And as for taking it away from welfare spending, etc., there's no reason for that. It's very easy to raise the money for this. I'm glad that it was mentioned with regards global corporations and maybe a global tax body. The G77 have been calling for it for the last few years. It's that kind of thing that's important. Raise the money from our own natural resources. Those who use CO2, those who use land.
Okay.
It's there now.
Right. Okay, thanks. So the question is, why don't we use the wealth that we have now? But we'll just go to another couple of questions. There's one here in the front row.
Hi. It was very fascinating because this is a very burning issue. Before Becky just mentioned the political will, I was just about to raise the hand and say, well, you know, what about the political will? And because Caroline is representing the World Bank here, so she would be on the other side of the question. But my question is, again, since World Bank, apart from all other representative here, has more leverage in terms of bargaining power in the world. And then talking about, when I say political will, what I'm referring to a big chunk of corrupt politicians in the very areas that we are talking about. So yes, the money is there, but would a taxation system, a universal system, would that work? So I just wanted to know World Bank's perspective on that. It's like, yes, the policy is there, the flagship report is there, it makes sense, but what do we do on the ground with that kind of power that World Bank has with most of the countries? What is the strategy? What is the plan now? How are you going to put it in practice? We understand the ideal solutions, but how are we going to combat with those kind of political elements? Not even in developing countries, but in developed countries, all the conflicts are being funded by northern lords, weapon lords. So how are we going to practically, what are the dynamics of practice on the ground? That would be my take, like my question on this one.
Okay, thank you. So what is the World Bank's strategy to beat inequality? So big question, but let's just have one more here.
Hi, my name is Shira, and I'm doing a PhD on financial inequalities, really. So I've covered topics such as financial inclusion, which I think is quite interesting because you were talking about cash transfers and so on and so forth. And financial inclusion is about, you know, making more people have access to banks and financial services. So what's your opinion on providing such services to, you know, to the poor when there are also the kind of comments that are saying that it could be misused to deepen financial services and, you know, actually make inequalities become more stark and pronounced as before? Thank you.
So that's the argument sort of for and against financial inclusion and getting more people to have bank accounts and yeah, the positives and negatives from that. Okay. Carolina, Carolina, are you okay? Oh, sorry.
Sure. I mean, I fully agree with the idea that, you know, globally we have the resources to end extreme poverty. Globally we have the resources to end hunger. I mean, there are so many things we could do globally if only we had the political will and the coordination mechanisms, but unfortunately we don't have them, or, you know, they are not all quite aligned. And, you know, I find it quite interesting that you think that the World Bank has the power to do that. Unfortunately, we don't. I think we sort of, what we do, I think we do two things. One is most of the work that we do is actually at the country level in terms of the real sort of policy conversation, if you want. And there I see our role as really sort of advocating for the right policies with governments, right? And when possible, sort of nudging them to move in that direction. And some of the policies were the ones that I outlined earlier, and trying again to help them do two things. I think one thing that is critical to move this debate forward is I think we need to break away a little bit from this notion, for example, that growth and inequality, that there's a trade-off between the two. Because I think a lot of the unwillingness that we have to tackle the inequality problem is because I think there's this sort of fear that is going to undermine, economic growth. And we know that when you look at the problem rather than in a static way, in a dynamic way, what we see is actually that you could generate a virtuous circle where you promote more equity, and that itself pays in the form of growth. So I think part of our role is, to change a little bit the tone of the conversation, to try to get more of that consensus around the importance of tackling inequality, and at the country level, to engage in dialogue about what needs to be done and how. At the global level, I think like Oxfam and others, our role is primarily advocacy. I think putting evidence out there, Oxfam has decided to focus on wealth as something that they're really sort of driving the conversation on. At the World Bank, we are more focused on inequality on income, poverty, of course, and also inequality on other types of outcomes like, access to services, et but I think putting the evidence out there and continuing to share the facts and make it clear that, sometimes we do have the means to tackle these things, we just need to have the willingness is important as well. But again, a lot of what we do is at the country level, and, we are driven by what countries want to do. I mean, we no longer, I don't think we ever did, but I think we are not in a world where we tell countries what to do. So that's not really how things work. But that doesn't mean that you can't really do things. I think evidence is very powerful. Sharing experiences of countries that have succeeded in doing these things is very powerful, and we see that really changing minds in ways that we didn't think were possible before. And I think the attention that the topic is getting at the moment is also helping all of us working in this sphere make those points much more clearly.
Yes, thank you. Becky, you had something to add?
Just on political will, I mean, it is, because we're living in a system that is entrenched, right, and it's been entrenched for decades, if not centuries. So it is hard to change things. Change is hard, and it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a number of different strategies and different tactics to make change happen. And that's at the multilateral level, which is always difficult, and then at the national level as well. But it can happen, and it does happen. And obviously in my work, what I believe is the predominant thing that makes change happen is people, and people engaging with the solutions. And we have seen change on this issue, not lots in the last few years, but we have seen change happen. So, for instance, if you just look at the UK on tax, now we haven't kind of eradicated tax havens, but we have made movements towards greater tax transparency. And what you need to have is the right combination of an opportunity to do that. So, for instance, last year the Panama Papers were leaked, and then we had an anti-corruption summit in this country, and therefore David Cameron was forced to put tax and tax corruption on the agenda. Having the public engage with that, having 330,000 people ask for an end to tax havens at the same time, allowed us to raise their voice and use that as a way to demonstrate the need for change. And that turns into political will, right? So then they committed last year to within a kind of the space of a year, although we're still pushing them on it, to institute mandatory public country-by-country reporting, which would force companies to say where they're generating their income, where they're paying their taxes. So political will, it's hard to achieve, but it's very possible. And I think the key way for us, the key way for me over the course of the next few years, is definitely to put an engaged public in every country in which we're working in at the heart of that political change.
Thank you. Yeah, and we also had a question about financial inclusion and sort of arguments for and against. I don't know if anyone would like to chip in on that. Did you have...
I'm no expert on it, so I don't have any. I wouldn't be the best person to answer this question, maybe. But in terms of inclusion, like the whole, I think that is the point that I would like to stress the most. In every facet of this work, so whether it be in terms of financial inclusion, or in terms of kind of governance, in terms of citizenship, I think it's important that people are part of an integrated system and are able to be represented and to represent themselves in such systems.
Maybe the only thing I would add to that is that I think we do know that lack of access to productive assets, right, including credit, is one of the biggest constraints for poor people to be able to lift themselves out of poverty. So in that sense, financial inclusion is critical. At the same time, we also know that promoting just financial inclusion without giving people the tools to leverage that, right? So giving them, making them able to sort of be financially literate, right? So not just having a bank account, but understanding what that means, understanding what having credit means, etc. Without doing that, financial inclusion will only get you so far. So I think what the evidence tells us, from what's happening at the country level is that financial inclusion can be a really powerful tool to fight poverty when you package it with other sorts of interventions that help people use that for a productive, activity, and then manage, for example, credit rather than making it in the end a liability for them, right? So I think that's quite important, that distinction in terms of a single measure versus a package of policies that support a single goal.
Thank you, that's great. And we have a clip from the World Bank that brings up some of those questions, and we'll show that now. I think you've covered sort of what the World Bank is doing to tackle these problems. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add from that video about how you are planning to end extreme poverty by 2030 and what.
Well, hopefully we are not the ones planning on it, but countries are, right? And we are helping them in the process. Again, I think let's not overestimate sort of the power of the institution. But I think when we work at the country level, we really do a variety of things. We provide both sort of, if you want, financial and advisory support to countries. And I think in that sense, if you look across the interventions that we are supporting, they touch upon all those issues that came up in the video and that I was talking about before. Investing in human capital with a particular focus on children. And how would you do that? And, I'm bringing the issue of it's not just about access, but it's about quality. Right? I think we've made a lot of progress on the access front, but not necessarily on the quality. People are not accessing the same service depending on whether they are poor or not. We talk about access to economic opportunities, right? Jobs, formalization, etc. So we support that both financially and in terms of helping governments think through, what's the impact that the policies are going to have and how can they enhance the poverty impacts of that. That work is supported by a lot of analysis that we do in-house that then helps us sort of bring that evidence, as I was saying earlier, to the debate. So that's also something that we do. This video was based on a global report that we published on inequality a little bit over half a year ago. So I think that's also important in informing the conversation, creating awareness, putting numbers out there, and then bringing that global conversation to the country context and saying, well, what does that mean for you, right, in the context of your specific problems, your specific policies. So we try to create those connections as well.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and I think from what we've seen from just how much inequality is part of conversation in the last few years, that's a huge leap. So I don't think we should underestimate that there has been change and there is changes coming. So yes, let's go to questions. There's
yeah, just a small correction. It's not 8 people that have the same wealth as half the rest of the population. It's 8 men that have the same wealth, as probably the other half of the population who's in poverty, the majority of whom are probably women. So I just wondered if the panel could talk a little bit more about the gender dimension.
Yeah, great question. So there's lots of other inequalities, gender inequalities, women that are working hard and not getting paid for it. What has to happen to address those inequalities? I'm not sure. But before we go to that, let me just take another couple of questions.
Yeah, hi. My name is Jessica Simons. I'm an anthropologist, and I did research over in Salford, which is the city just next to Manchester, in a low-income community. And what I found was that the language of poverty is a real serious problem for people there. So I learned not to use terms like poverty, disadvantaged, inequality. And I wondered to what extent the people on the panel think that using terms like inequality and poverty is actually part of the problem.
Yeah, interesting idea about stigmatization, and if that is more of a problem than it is a help. And I have one more question, just this one here.
Hi, I'm Chandrika Devarakonda. I come from early childhood background, and the clip that you just aired that almost answered most of my questions. I picked on few terms that you use, like political will, very, very important, and access to policies also was mentioned, which is very important again. And I'm picking on the term inequality from the perspective of early childhood education, as well as the families who will be accessing early childhood as well as education at the later level. But then from the perspective of inclusion, which is something that I'm very passionate about, how does the early childhood education or education as such is picked on by the panel and also the Global Development Institute as well?
So what does research say about early child education? Is that what you're asking? Sorry.
In terms of political will and in terms of inclusion, in terms of inequality, how is inequality being dealt with through inclusion or inclusive education, for example? Okay. And then I know political will is very much important, but then at lots of different levels. But then how is that being dealt?
So what kind of policies for children? Okay, great. Okay, so we'll start with a question about gender inequality. Did you want to start, Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fact, right? It's 8 men who are the same as the poorest half of the world. And the poorest half of the world are the most marginalised people, and often you find the most marginalised people are women. And that is because they are doing the majority of unpaid care work and not being recognised for it. And they're the ones who often don't benefit from access to, basic services like healthcare and education. So they're kind of continuously suffering for it and continuously on the front line of, the informal economy and kind of invested and absorbed in agriculture work in developing countries as well. So there is a massively gendered impact to economic inequality, and there's huge intersectionalities between, gender, horizontal inequalities, vertical inequalities. And what we're constantly struggling, if I'm being perfectly honest, we're struggling as to how to find the right policy solutions to put at the heart of the inequality debate to address this huge disparity between men and women in terms of economic inequality. But it's certainly something that we know that we have to put at the heart of what we're doing, and women's economic empowerment is certainly one of the things one of the ways in which we see we can address economic inequality. And I think through programs like our Enterprise Development Programme, which encourages women to invest in and start their own enterprises and gives money to them in order to be able to do that, there's some of the ways that through our programme work we're doing this. I just think in terms of policy, we've still, as Oxfam, we've got to work harder in figuring out how we put women at the heart of this debate and at the heart of what we do.
Yeah, I'll just see what the rest of the panel has. Yeah, because it would be great to hear about what the World Bank, how you are sort of factoring in the gender question into your policies and programs.
So we did a sort of a global report on gender a few years ago, and I think that provided us with quite a few interesting insights in terms of where to focus efforts. And what that sort of, if you want, the main message of that was the following. That is, if you look at different areas where we have gender gaps, right? And, in education, for example, right? In health, in access to economic opportunities, in voice and empowerment. And you take a long-term perspective, interestingly, what you see is that some of those gaps actually close with development, and education is one of them. We see poorer countries having larger gender gaps, but as they become richer, those gaps close. Right? So in a way, in addressing some of those gaps, really what you want to promote is just broad development, right, in these countries. However, other gaps are sort of sticky, right, in the sense that you observe them in the UK, you observe them in developing countries, and therefore they require a specific policy intervention. So that was our first argument. Where should we focus our efforts? We should focus them on those gaps that don't close with development, right, that are sticky. And those primarily from the World Bank perspective, what we focus on are issues related to health, and particularly issues related to access to economic opportunities. And what you see there is that the underlying causes, if you want, of those sticky gaps relate to both unequal access to productive assets. So this relates to the question, for example, earlier about access to credit, but also access to land. Women just tend not to have control over these assets, and therefore it's very hard for them, to engage in productive work that pays a decent wage and so on. But very importantly, a lot of these gaps are also driven by social norms, and basically the role that women play in childcare and the expectation that they take care both of the house and the children, and how that constrains their ability to be in the labor market. So sometimes you have to sort of tackle the norms before you succeed in closing the gap. And that relates a little bit to the question on early childhood development, because I think one of the things that has become clearer and clearer over time is that if we want women to enter the labor market in higher numbers, right, and to be able to access good jobs, one of the things that we're going to have to change is their responsibilities in terms of childcare and provide them with more support, for example. So that's something that we are focusing on at the moment.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, before we go on to the other questions, keep tweeting your questions to TOI17. Rory, I don't know if you wanted to add anything on the gender inequalities?
I thought I'd add something on the comment about whether the language of inequality and poverty is a sort of productive one to use. And I mean, we are at an event called Taking on Inequalities, so I don't want to completely undermine the title of the event. But one really fascinating article I read about 3 weeks ago, 3 Yale psychologists, a piece in Science called Why People Don't Care About Inequality. And it'll be, I don't know, maybe you have a reaction to this as well. The basic argument was that we often conflate fairness with inequality. So when people say inequality is an important issue, actually when they do these behavioral studies of people, and so if you have 2 children in a room and you have 5 sweets, if you just give them both 2 sweets each and then you put one in the bin because you want to treat them all equally and you don't want to favor one. But then if you tell them, well, one of these children behaved badly earlier today, then people will give 3 sweets to one child and they'll be okay with having an uneven distribution because you factor in merit and need to a greater degree. And so this, in a way, the title about why people don't care about inequality was misleading. It should in a way be people really care about fairness. But that we often tend to conflate inequality, and that sometimes inequality may not be the most productive way to think of things. Partly there's a real danger at the moment that inequality becomes, as the benefit is that people talk a lot more about inequality, the danger is that we talk about inclusive everything. Financial inclusiveness, inclusive education, inclusive everything. So suddenly everything's inclusive, whether in name, whether it is or not. And that also talking about inequality to some people, in a way, perpetuates it and makes it seem inevitable and like you can't do anything about it. So there's really interesting thinking about behaviorally and how people perceive the issue, what the effective what the effective language is that people react to.
Absolutely.
Do you think we should say fairness rather than
Well,
inequality?
I don't know. I think probably yes. You know, our audience research at the minute, we've recently got some back that suggests that people find it very hard to associate this kind of high-order concept of inequality with impact and with solutions. So we need to make the language that we use around it much more tangible. However, I do think that article was really misleading in some ways because it didn't say that people don't. It said that people don't want absolute equal societies, right? That's what it said. It didn't say people wanted the level of inequality that we have now. So I think, there could have been a number of different titles for that article. One of them probably should have been People Want Less Inequality, which is essentially what it said. But yes, there is certainly something around this concept, this idea of fairness and economic fairness. And that also touches in on like the issues that I was talking about earlier in terms of rigged rules and inclusion. People feel like, you know, there has to be a sense of justice, and I guess fairness probably is quite a useful term and a useful frame for us to be talking about inequality with people who aren't quite as embedded in the debate as we all are.
Can I add
Yeah.
to that? Because I think it's a very sort of pertinent observation. Because, you know, sometimes we are asked this question, I'm sure you've been asked this question before, of is there a right level of inequality, right? And I think, you know, the short answer is, well, no. And it's true that when you look across countries, I think the tolerance for inequality varies a lot across countries. For example, I mean, I think in general we know that in East Asian countries, which have relatively high inequality and have had high inequality for a while, it hasn't really created a lot of sort of social tension in the past. I mean, it may now that is sort of growing, but they seem to have a higher tolerance for that. Whereas, for example, in sort of ex-Soviet countries, where inequality levels are in absolute terms quite low, there is a lot of preoccupation about inequality. So what's sort of underlying that, right? And I think that's in a way what you were trying to get at. And I think work that we've done, you know, looking at different countries and sort of public perceptions of whether inequality is a problem or not, is it too high, is it too low, point in two directions. One is this issue of fairness, right? So I think people are much more comfortable with relatively high, if you want, levels of inequality, if there is a perception that inequality, that the processes underlying those inequalities are fair, in the sense that people are being rewarded for their efforts, you know, or for their skills, rather than, for example, because they have connections, right? So I think that's actually quite important, because I think it does then translate into what the debate is in the country level and the support for different types of policies. The other thing that is critical, and I think this relates to the question that you were asking the audience before, is that, again, the view on inequality is actually a lot more positive if people see the process of growth being accompanied by economic mobility, and particularly if they have a sense that their kids will do better than they did, right? So I think the sort of the uncomfort with the inequality, you know, and we've seen that grow, really comes from the idea that, you know, the fear that the future generations, right, in this environment that is becoming more unequal, won't have the same opportunities that the current generation had. So I think taking into account these things is critical when we think about solutions, because, you know, in the end, you are operating in a particular country environment, and you have to look for allies for those policies and understand what's the root cause of, you know, of the problem and the reaction to the problem.
Okay, thank you. Should we take some more questions from a bit further back? There's a guy at the back over here. Somebody in the middle over there.
So there's quite an overwhelming body of evidence now that the kind of policies that the World Bank, the IMF promote, stuff like trade liberalization, connecting developing countries to the global economy, which actually in a lot of cases just creates races to the bottom in price and that kind of thing. There's an overwhelming body of evidence that that doesn't really work now. That's failing a lot of places in the world. Well, it's failing a lot of developing countries. It's actually doing really well for the West because it's giving us a lot of low-priced things. Do you not think, in light of that, we should maybe move the focus away from things like free markets and globalization and that kind of language, which we're still using in this debate here? It's still dominated in this panel here. Do you not think that we should be moving away from that sort of language? And perhaps a first step in doing that would be, at the very least, radically structurally adjusting institutions like the World Bank and the IMF.
How do you mean restructuring? What?
I would personally go further into abolishing, but structurally adjusting, I meant as sort of a pun on the structural adjustment programs, which the IMF and the World Bank promote heavily. Okay. But certainly changing their whole sort of way of operating.
So, like, institutions aren't helping to reduce inequality, sort of the development banks, is that what you're saying? And,
yeah, the sort of focus on free market policies, on globalization, on liberalization, so privatization, cutting of the state, that kind of thing. There seems to be a sort of implicit assumption that that's necessarily a good thing, and also that economic growth is this sort of panacea that we should be looking for, when in fact economic growth is actually quite often accompanied by massive rises in inequality and child poverty.
Okay, thank you. Another question here? Yeah.
I don't think there's much dissent on the panel, and probably not in this room, about the fact that inequality is a bad thing and more or less what the causes are. But that view is hardly universal. If you look at the Chicago School, for example, they argue that inequality is actually a good thing because it includes it encourages enterprise and people to strive. Becky referred earlier to the rise of populism, and with that comes the idea that it's always somebody else's fault, that inequality is the fault of immigrants, or is the fault of the EU, or is, most corrosive of all, the fault of the poor themselves. That in this country, if you're poor, it's because you're lazy or feckless and like living off the greatly bloated state benefits available to you. So my question really for the panel is what are their ideas on how to counter this corrosive rhetoric that is seemingly becoming more and more pervasive at the moment?
Okay, thank you. So how do you counter the argument that inequality could be a good thing? And then we'll just take one more question. This guy here. Oh. So can you pass your microphone?
Thanks. To follow up from a few of the points that have been made about the sort of dogma that economic growth can sort of help inequality, because for me it seems inherently linked to climate change. And I think climate change is going to be a really big obstacle for tackling inequality. So to take a few examples, like increasing the amount of droughts, floods, and this will sort of impact poorer people more and exacerbate inequality even more. So what do the panel think about degrowth as a solution? And just to preempt a sort of classic objection to degrowth about it be unfair on the poorer countries to restrict their growth, we've already sort of mentioned that we currently have the resources to tackle inequality now. So it doesn't seem like if we did do a policy of degrowth that would affect that much.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, really good point to bring up the impacts of climate change and whether in the light of that there should be degrowth rather than growth. So who would like to start on those great questions? Yep.
I can start on countering corrosive rhetoric. You referred earlier to kind of research that's happened on perceptions of inequality, and I think that's something that we've been really interested in recently because of work that Chris Hoy at the ODI is doing. And he refers to, so that there aren't that many studies about perceptions of inequality. We don't really know that much about perceptions of inequality at the minute. However, there's a study in Indonesia, there are a couple in the US, and the one in Indonesia basically asks people, you know, how great is inequality, how big is inequality? They massively underestimate the scale of the problem. And then they're asked where to put themselves on the distribution scale. And then there's this really strange median effect going on. So the richest people think they're poorer than they are, and the poorest people think that they're richer than they are. And then at the same time, everyone thinks that, you know, social mobility is really easy and they're going to move up into the next decile within the next 5 years, when in fact social mobility is actually pretty much impossible at the minute in Indonesia. So the reason why that's important and why that's interesting is because there's something that we can do about demonstrating the scale of the problem to people and uncovering a truth in this post-truth era, telling a truth about the scale of inequality, because people don't actually understand that yet, right? And when you explain to them, or when it is explained to people, the scale of inequality and where they sit within that spectrum, then their appetite for redistribution and their appetite for the right kind of policies increases. So in the US, people were shown a scale of kind of global inequality, and they were asked how charity, they were assessed on charitable giving and support for foreign aid before and after. Their support for foreign aid increased once they understood the scale of global inequality, never mind kind of within country inequality. So I think there's something around, in terms of kind of combating that corrosive rhetoric, we need to start telling the story better in terms of perceptions of inequality. People need to understand the scale of inequality, and then I think a natural fallout from that will be people will be more inclined to support redistribution and see redistribution as an answer and as a solution. That's the first thing. On the point about kind of getting rid of the World Bank and getting rid of institutions like the World Bank, I don't have much to say in terms of specific policies, because there are things that the World Bank could do differently, less focus on privatization, especially in terms of things like education. However, these institutions play an implicit and an important role in serving multilateralism, in global cooperation, in us seeing the world as a unit and trying to work towards global solutions. And without institutions, like multilateral institutions, I think what we're going to be facing is that race to the bottom in terms of nationalism. People will just become much more insular. So they're the kind of, multilateral institutions are kind of the stakes in the ground about, holding on to global solutions to global problems, which this is.
Thank you. Nice to hear a defence of the World Bank. Rory, do you want to add something? Yeah,
I mean, one comment on the perceptions of inequality again. Pew Research, who do these global attitude survey I mentioned earlier, they ask people about what they see as the cause of inequality. The US and the UK, people both rate how hard people work and whether they're lazy as the biggest cause of inequality. Whereas in other countries, it's trade, it's government policies, it's a whole variety of different causes. And then those two are particularly countries where we see quite high within-country inequality. Particularly in a context of neopopulism at the moment, the real tendency is to blame essentially poor foreigners, like you said, for domestic problems, in a way for domestic inequality, that making it seem like there's not enough resources in the UK for the health system, for et cetera, even though tax rates on the rich have fallen, et cetera, and you blame poor foreigners. And I think the really important aspect of much of the inequality debate that comes out is it is a policy choice. It relates to the question earlier about the basic income. There is growing awareness, not just in the global north, but what the World Bank is emphasizing is in the global south, inequality is more and more a policy choice, including at the domestic level. There are some international factors that are important. In the US manufacturing sector, some jobs have been shown to be lost, particularly in relation to trade with China. But in general, there is still considerable domestic scope, and I think that's both troubling in that that's where the inequalities have increased, but it also shows where the potential is in terms of the choice. One brief comment on the World Bank question. I think it's actually really interesting here, and Mario was talking, who was an author of the report, was talking earlier that a few years ago you wouldn't have expected a World Bank report on inequality, and I think, could you ever imagine a World Bank report on degrowth? To build on the degrowth question.
That's a good question.
In 10 years' time.
Okay, so I'm glad that Becky and Rory addressed the why the World Bank should exist question, as opposed to my having to say that. But more seriously, I think I agree with the point that Becky made in terms of the role that not just the World Bank, but I think multilateral institutions can create in terms of being a little bit the glue that prevents this sort of pull towards sort of national policies and very nationally focused objectives that we see at the moment. So I think that's an important role that we play, together with more broadly sort of advocacy around critical issues such as poverty reduction. So I won't sort of dwell more into that. I do want to come back though to the sort of issue of globalization and some of the other policies. Actually, my reading on the impact of globalization on poverty is a little bit different, and I think we do have sufficient evidence that a lot of the progress that we've seen in extreme poverty reduction over the last couple of years has been helped by nations being more integrated and by international trade. So we shouldn't sort of throw out the baby with the bathwater and say, well, this is a bad thing. I think in general, developing countries did benefit from that higher level of integration. We were talking before about growth in China and India and how, in a way, global inequality has declined over time precisely because those very countries have caught up with developed economies. And we know that trade, among other things, played a role in that. What we cannot deny is that trade has also had unequalizing impacts, for the most part, within countries. And I think a lot of that in developed countries, which is, I think, what's dominating a lot of the conversation about inequality and sort of populism, et cetera, right? The sense that there are winners and losers, and the losers feel that policy have not addressed, you know, the risks and the sort of consequences of sort of global integration. So I think, you know, with trade as well as with issues like you were talking about promoting competition or privatization, I wouldn't want to think about these policies in absolute terms, right? I mean, they are good or they are bad. I think every policy is as good or bad as the implementation, you know, as how you implement it. And I think what's critical is for governments to think about, you know, how a particular policy will be implemented in the country and who are likely to be the winners and losers of that implementation. And I think a lot of what we do with countries is precisely to help them think through that process. And if there are losers, to try to think about how you can mitigate some of the negative impacts of those interventions. So again, you know, a little bit more of an agnostic view on sort of policy tools, and I think a much more practical approach to understanding the distributional impacts of different policies and mitigating the negative impacts of those.
Yeah, thank you. And what about the question about feeling the impacts of climate change and in that?
Actually, very, very important point. You know, the World Bank has sort of set these goals for the work that we do, right, of poverty reduction and sort of promoting income growth at the bottom of the distribution. But part of what sort of gets forgotten sometimes when we talk about these goals is that what we say is achieving those goals in a sustainable manner. And, you know, the whole sort of climate change issue and, you know, environmental degradation, et cetera, is a critical part of that sustainable sort of piece of achieving the twin goals. And in fact, we know that, again, as we make progress towards eliminating extreme poverty, the pockets of extreme poverty that are left, you know, among those are people that live in areas that are prone to natural disasters and therefore are much more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So I think as we try to make more progress towards this goal, addressing those kinds of issues becomes, you know, even more critical, thinking about climate change and its impact on, you know, particularly on the welfare of those at the bottom of the distribution.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Becky, would you like to add something?
I mean, there are it's part of like the human economy paper that we put out, and there's one of the kind of key things that we argue in that is that there are finite resources in the world, and we probably can't keep on growing in the way that we're growing at the minute. And there's really interesting conversation, which I'm not well equipped to talk to, but around what do we measure in terms of progress? And we have to start measuring beyond GDP. So we have to start measuring our impact on the environment. We have to start measuring unpaid care. You know, GDP doesn't take into account inequality properly, you know. High GDP growth doesn't necessarily, in Zambia, at the same time as increasing inequality, increasing poverty. So I think that there's a bigger debate about, you know, what you measure in terms of progress, and part of that debate absolutely has to be sustainable growth and alternatives to GDP. And there's an interesting piece come out from Kate Raworth recently around donut economics, which she looks at kind of social flaws and environmental ceilings. And perhaps that's something that we should be looking towards more in terms of not just dealing with inequality, but dealing with climate change as well simultaneously.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Donut Economics. That's a great book I've just started reading, so perhaps we'll have solutions in there to a new model for combating inequality. I think we're almost running out of time, but if there's any like burning last questions, we could take one here and then one at the back.
Thank you. Every time when such kind of very important issues are raised or discussed, the political issue will appear, and it will always remain untouched. rather than being said. So I would say that unless there's some kind of radical action taken at certain level, that political will, particularly from the powerful players, will never come, because it's something that should be earned rather than just given willingly. And linking to the question that with regard to World Bank, it's not about challenging multilateralism, but rather it's challenging the ideological narrative that has been driving it, which sustains inequality that has been there for centuries. For instance, I'm happy that Rory mentioned about Niger, which is the poorest nation in the world, but the resource that's extracted from this poorest nation, uranium, is giving light to France, like at least one out of 3 bulbs in France are lighted by uranium that's extracted from Niger. So if, not necessarily hypothetically, but I think it's possible, like for instance, if a country such as Niger has the power, has the political power within Niger to make a clear statement that we no longer accept such kind of trade relations, whatever kind of thing, how would the World Bank react? How would the European Union react? They have never given any solution for such kinds of sustained inequality, which has been there for centuries, but if such kind of action is taken by a country, DRC or Angola or Niger, whichever country that's extracting lots of resources to the global north, but not benefiting there. I think that kind of radical decisions from the other side will definitely kick on the political will that we are always aspiring, but never being able to get it. Thank you.
Thank you. So how do we respond to sort of entrenched historic inequalities and kind of start to address those? Okay.
Yes, my question goes in a similar direction. We have talked mostly about inequality in terms of economic inequality, but we also find significant inequality in power. And we can see that a lot, both in developed and developing countries. And when we're talking about policies that address issues of inequality, we're mostly talking about policies that imply, to a certain extent, a redistribution in power. And when those same actors, those very same actors, powerful actors, both political, economic elites, are the ones that are in charge or are capable of pursuing such policies and guaranteeing an effective implementation of policies to address inequality, how do we address the issue that, how do we guarantee that these actors who would be, to a certain extent, the losers in pursuing these policies, how do we overcome the challenges of pursuing policies that imply a redistribution of power for the actors that are pursuing them?
Okay, thank you. So how do we get political elites that may not benefit from redistribution of power to commit to that political will? So yeah, I think 2 connected questions. I don't know who would like to.
Yeah, I can sort of get us started.
Yeah.
I think this is true, right? That a lot of, that sometimes it's the very elite that doesn't obviously want to support sort of redistributive policies. But I think it's important to understand that a lot of times political power or sort of elite capture reflects sort of economic power, right, or control of certain institutions. And I think if we think about it that way, we will see that we have a lot more entry points into sort of undermining, if you want, some of this elite capture than that we tend to think about if we only think about it in terms of just tackling the political issue directly, right, which sometimes institutionally it's hard to do. For example, we know that in many countries, economic activity in particular markets is controlled by a few families, right, or a few individuals, and that gives them both economic power as well as political power. Promoting competition in those markets is an indirect way, right, of undermining that power and giving entry to other economic actors in that market that would benefit from being present. Becky was talking earlier about about transparency, just asking for the publication, for example, of, sort of wealth or asset ownership. Again, you're not redistributing, but you're sort of, putting this information in the public sphere and promoting a debate around that. And I think there are a lot of things that we actually can do that don't necessarily, again, talk about a political system, right, which is, I think it's sort of a national issue and a difficult sort of issue for institutions like the World Bank to talk about, but that indirectly would impact, who holds the power and why in a particular country. So I think that's what I was saying before. For example, competition, is it good or bad? Well, I don't know. I mean, you can use competition to actually promote sort of economic inclusion, inclusiveness and undermine elite control. So in that case, it would be a good thing, right? So I think, we have to sort of
more
think about
transparency about where money is held and where it's going.
Exactly.
And relating to that is the story of we have to continue to expose political capture. So the fact that there's a great paper from Oxfam America just a few months ago, just ahead of when Donald Trump was supposed to be putting out his tax returns, which he didn't, which highlighted the fact that the 50 biggest companies in the US have spent something like $2.5 billion on lobbyists in Washington, and 300 million of that has been spent on lobbying on tax. And then those very same companies have $1.6 trillion hidden in tax havens, right? So, I mean, that's a perfect example of political capture and the revolving door between politics and those, economic strength. And it's about continuously exposing that and making sure that you're encouraging the public to support action for it. If we don't start making greater efforts to engage publics and to use our voice, everybody in this room, use your voice to engage your communities and engage those around you, then we're not going to see the change that we want to see. So it's about putting the evidence out there and exposing what's going on, and then using your sphere of influence to help spread the word on that. And then secondly, I think, importantly in terms of political influence, we as civil society need to do more to redress the balance of power. We can play a role in this. So the best example for me is a couple of years ago was the Financing for Development conference, and I led Oxfam's work at that conference. And it was the most amazing experience because what we'd been supporting the G77 to ask for was a global tax body and was greater cooperation, and for them to have a seat at the table and determine global tax rules. And the civil society that was there continually supported with evidence, with research, with voice, developing countries to continue pressing for it. Now, they didn't get it in the end, but they held out longer than they've ever held out before for something in the face of massive pressure and huge resources from developed countries. And I think that's something that we need to keep pressing on with, putting power back to developing countries and ensuring that we as civil society are helping them raise their voice when it comes to those kind of negotiations.
Thank you. Rory, did you have anything you wanted to add? There's basically about Niger and the sort of entrenched kind of inequality there and how you sort of go about addressing these kind of imbalances.
I think Eob knows I don't actually know a lot about Niger, but I was bringing it up in the context of that example. But I mean, the one point I would respond to I think the political power issue is really central. It's not one that's necessarily, if it was easy, we probably wouldn't necessarily have the scale of inequality that we do. Personally, I think the Oxfam work on particularly looking at extreme wealth and looking at an economy for the 99% and this 1%, 99% in a time when in the UK people are divided 52% and 48% over Brexit, and America people are divided over Republicans and Democrats, and in many other countries around the world people are divided between smaller. It's actually all of those people that generally are missing out and losing out from extreme inequality, and perhaps also the actual extremely wealthy people who are trying to throw away their money quicker than they don't even know how to get rid of their money if they really want to. So I think really thinking about this conversation more in terms of the vast majority of the population and then the extreme wealthy at the other end is actually quite productive to building up a broader consensus about this issue.
Okay, thank you. And then if I can ask you all to give your final comments and to tell me what your personal favorite solution would be to global inequalities and which you would be sort of pumping for and pushing for to so that we can move beyond kind of all agreeing that this is a problem to how we can try and fix it and address it.
Me first. So my, a plea and a call again, I know I've said it again and again, but I really do believe that it's only people like us who are engaged in the conversation who have the, it's us who are going to make this change happen. And I do believe that investing in communities and investing in the conversation and making sure that solutions that we've outlined in that paper that you just referred to, making sure that they're part of our conversation is absolutely key to addressing inequality. My favourite solution, I'll never stop banging on about it because I've been banging on about it for 2 years, is in the immediate is a global tax body, so global cooperation on tax to prevent a further race to the bottom and to prevent further tax dodging, which also gives a great voice to developing countries and gives them a seat at the table. So in terms of tax, I would like to see much greater cooperation and the prevention of the ongoing race to the bottom on tax. And then something that we've not actually touched on, which I'd really hoped to touch on, was the idea of putting a completely different model of business at the heart of business. So instead of increased profitability going to shareholders, instead, you put social benefit at the heart of business. And this exists, it's out there. You know, there are cooperatives, social enterprises, so many different business models that we should be embracing.